Hey guys, tonight we walk into the mud brick dusk of ancient Sumer, where reeds whisper at the riverbanks, lamp smoke curls beneath temple ceilings, and damp clay tablets wait in neat little stacks like the world's oldest anxiety archive. Some parts of this story are widely accepted history, some parts are interpretation, and some parts are calm. What if imagination? Because when you read old myths about powerful beings moving through the sky and slipping away from cities, historians debate what those movements really mean. You may hear echoes of real floods, real kings, and real temple economies, but you may also notice hints that could suggest a stranger mood beneath the surface, as if the stories themselves are glancing over their shoulders. And as always, you probably would not survive this very well, mostly because Bronze Age city life includes heat mud taxes and approximately zero sympathy for your modern need for a decent mattress. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and post your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin where the evidence is strongest, on the southern plains of Mesopotamia, in the land between rivers where Sumerian cities rise from flat alluvium with the stubbornness of baked brick and organised faith. Most historians agree that these early cities are not fantasy kingdoms floating in legend, but real urban centres with temples, storehouses, workshops, canals and scribes who spend long hours pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. Archaeology suggests that places like Uruk-ur, Eridu, Lagash and Nippur are deeply structured worlds full of labour, hierarchy, grain accounting and ritual obligation. The gods are everywhere in the official imagination, but so are barley rations, irrigation ditches, and the eternal administrative romance of someone asking where the shipment went. You walk through one of these cities in your mind at first light. The streets are uneven, the walls are thick, the air already carries warmth even before the sun fully climbs. Somewhere nearby, dough is being slapped into shape, and somewhere else a goat is making a complaint, so passionate it deserves its own tablet series. You pass workers carrying baskets, a priestly official moving with practiced dignity, and a boy learning to smooth a lump of clay before his teacher makes him rewrite the same sign again and again. Civilization, in other words, is happening. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer is one of the earliest places on Earth where urban life becomes dense, literate, and administratively complex on a large scale. The evidence we do have points to a culture intensely concerned with order, distribution, devotion, and survival. And survival matters here more than your soft modern brain may initially appreciate. This is a landscape of astonishing productivity, yes, but also fragility. Rivers can nourish or destroy. Canals must be maintained. Fields can flourish and then fail. A city does not merely exist because people wish it to. It must be fed, defended, counted, repaired, and richly stabilised. A more cautious explanation for many dramatic Sumerian texts is simply that people living in such conditions become very good at imagining disorder, because disorder is never theoretical for long. It is a blocked canal, a weak harvest, a cracked wall, an absent shipment, a king who misjudges an enemy, a storm that arrives with rude timing. Ancient life is full of consequences, which is a polite way of saying no one gets to miss 3 deadlines and call it self-care. So when later readers open Sumerian myths and hymns and notice anxious language around divine absence, movement, abandonment or disruption, the first solid ground is this. These texts come from a world already trained to fear instability. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, even on solid ground, the emotional tone of some texts can feel surprisingly unsettled. gods in Mesopotamian religion are not always abstract principles sitting politely above the clouds with perfect confidence and excellent posture. They are tied to cities, temples, cosmic roles, and political legitimacy, but in literary terms they also move, withdraw, rage, lament, decide, regret, and at times seem strangely hard to pin down. One interpretation is that such divine motion reflects changes in power, cult practice, or poetic symbolism. That is the mainstream safe road, and it is a sensible one. But a careful reading might suggest that some of this movement carries more tension than ceremony alone would require. That is where the mood of tonight's story begins, not in proof, not in revelation, but in atmosphere. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden truth handed to us on a golden platter, because ancient literature is rarely that kind, but a puzzle. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. If certain hymns, laments, and myths repeatedly show powerful beings leaving, withdrawing, or becoming hard to access, perhaps that only reflects the ordinary religious language of divine distance. That is entirely possible. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another shade appears. The gods do not only rule, at times in the texture of the writing, they seem to respond. Historians still argue whether these emotional textures should be read mainly as theology, political metaphor, ritual language, or memory shaped into myth. That debate matters because the old temptation is always to leap from strangeness to certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Strangeness does not equal secret knowledge. Strange texts are often just what human beings produce when the world feels unstable, and they need stories large enough to hold that feeling. But this raises the possibility that even the largest divine stories may preserve a whisper of unease. Take the setting itself. Southern Mesopotamia does not reward arrogance for long. Its cities depend on managed water and cooperative labour. Its boundaries shift. Its rulers compete. Its people live close to environmental risk. Archaeology suggests resilience, sophistication, and astonishing inventiveness, but not calm. So when the high gods of later tradition appear in ways that feel restless, one cautious explanation could be that human communities are projecting their own lived uncertainty into the heavens. The heavens become social, the gods become administrators with better jewellery. And honestly, if your whole civilization runs on grain accounts and weather luck, your deities may also start acting like managers during budget season. A fringe idea proposes that some ancient stories preserve memory of non-human beings reacting to a danger beyond human sight. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it lingers in popular imagination because it gives divine unease a dramatic cause. Maybe the theory says the Anunnaki are not merely rulers or judges in cosmic order. Maybe they are themselves under pressure. Maybe they are not standing at the top of the pyramid in serene command, but glancing upward, outward, or beyond. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence for such a claim is thin, and the mainstream view remains much more grounded in literary convention, theology, and social reality. Still, once the idea enters the room, it changes the lighting. You notice it most in the spaces between things, in the way a city can be both powerful and vulnerable, in the way a temple can represent stability while existing in a world that constantly threatens it, in the way scribes preserve not just triumph but lament. Sumerian literature, even when formal, often feels aware that order must be renewed because it does not hold automatically. Most historians agree that this is one of the civilization's defining insights. Cosmic order is precious precisely because chaos is near. So you stand there at the beginning, beside the river near the first cities, among workers, priests and scribes, and you let the old mood gather slowly. What's broadly accepted is that Sumer gives us urban complexity, writing kingship traditions and rich temple culture. One interpretation is that its myths also preserve the psychology of living under constant uncertainty. And what if just maybe a few of those stories carry a deeper dramatic instinct, the sense that even the beings above the city walls are not entirely at ease? We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues, and the first clue is simple. In the oldest clay before the storm fully forms, the world already feels like it is listening for footsteps. The footsteps seem to linger in the clay as evening deepens, and now you begin to look more closely at the beings who move through these old Sumerian and Mesopotamian stories with such authority and at times such curious restlessness. Most historians agree that the gods of Mesopotamia are not random fantasy decorations sprinkled over daily life for poetic flair. They are woven into everything. They explain kingship, agriculture, storms, fertility, judgment, war, protection, and the sacred architecture of the city itself. What's broadly accepted is that each major city tends to elevate a patron deity, and that temple life is not a side hobby, but a central institution in economy and society. Archaeology suggests that these temples function not only as sacred spaces, but also as centres of redistribution, record-keeping, labour, organisation and political meaning. In other words, religion here is not tucked neatly into one corner. It is the whole wallpaper. And yet, for all that apparent order, the gods do not always behave like beings perfectly settled in their roles. You notice this in hymns, myths, laments, and royal texts where divine presence matters deeply, but absence matters just as much. A city wants its god near. A king wants divine favour anchored. A temple wants ritual continuity. The people one suspects would also like their cosmic guardians to stop being mysterious for at least 5 minutes. But ancient literature is rarely so accommodating. Instead, the gods arrive, depart, descend, withdraw, transfer power, abandon shrines, or seem to shift their attention in ways that make the emotional texture of the texts more uneasy than serene. One interpretation is that this is simply how ancient theology works. Gods are mobile because divine power is not mechanical. Their movement can symbolise changing political fortunes, the fall of dynasties, the rise of rival cities, or the ceremonial logic of myth. That is a careful explanation, and often the best one. We will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, a careful reading might suggest that some of these narratives do not present divine movement as leisurely or purely majestic. Sometimes the motion feels reactive, as though the cosmic furniture is being rearranged in a hurry, while everyone pretends it is part of the decor. You can see why later readers become fascinated with the Anunnaki in particular. In Mesopotamian tradition, the term shifts across time and context, but it is broadly connected with a group of deities often associated with the underworld divine assembly or the great order of cosmic authority. Most historians agree that these are not extraterrestrials in the modern pop culture sense, despite the vigorous efforts of 20th century paperback mysticism to give everyone in antiquity a spaceship. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal advanced beings escaping some greater threat, but this theory is not widely accepted. The evidence we do have points far more solidly to mythic and theological functions shaped by human scribes, political needs and literary tradition. Still, the name itself carries weight, and the atmosphere around divine assemblies is worth noticing. Mesopotamian literature often imagines councils of gods, making decisions, negotiating outcomes, setting destinies, and responding to events. What's broadly accepted is that this reflects a highly social model of the divine world, one that mirrors earthly courts and hierarchies. A more cautious explanation could be that divine councils help human communities think through uncertainty by projecting it upward into cosmic drama. If kings argue, then gods will also argue. If cities face threats, then heaven too becomes a place of deliberation. That is not strange at all. It is very human. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another mood emerges. These councils sometimes feel less like relaxed sovereignty and more like emergency meetings with better robes. Historians still argue whether the apparent tension in such scenes reflects actual theological anxiety, poetic convention, or later editorial layering from different traditions. That debate matters because Mesopotamian texts are not all from one moment, one city, or one unified system. Sumerian material blends and overlaps with Akkadian traditions, later Babylonian reinterpretations, and centuries of scribal copying. Scholars continue to debate how much continuity we should assume. So when a god seems restless, that could mean many things. It could reflect changing cult practice. It could mark a literary trope. It could symbolize cosmic rhythm. Or it could preserve, in a very stylized form, the old feeling that even those at the top of the sacred order are responding to pressures outside the frame. That last thought remains speculation, and thin speculation at that. But it helps explain the atmosphere. You are not looking at a pantheon frozen in marble perfection. You are looking at a sacred world that breathes, argues, relocates, and occasionally sounds a little unsettled. The gods are strong, yes, but they are not always still. Consider the practical side of belief. If your city's identity is bound to a deity, then divine departure is not a small symbolic inconvenience. It is existential. A temple can stand, but if its god is imagined as withdrawn or absent, the city becomes spiritually exposed. This is why laments for ruined cities are so powerful later on. Divine absence feels almost physical. The room is still there, the incense might still burn, but the centre has stepped away. One interpretation is that this literary emphasis reflects political catastrophe translated into sacred emotion. A city falls, so of course its god seems to have left. That is mainstream and sensible. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well, something subtler, in the old imagination, where leaving is not only judgment, but response? And response to what? Here the mainstream answer is still the safest and strongest: war disorder, failed kingship, broken ritual, obligations, ecological stress, or the poetic need to explain suffering within a religious framework. Archaeology suggests that the ancient Near East experiences all of these in some combination. Cities rise and fall, power shifts, crops fail, armies arrive uninvited like the worst possible dinner guests. The gods move in the stories because the world moves under people's feet. But a popular rumour claims that behind some of these movements lies the memory of a larger threat, something even the high beings do not master. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because it gives divine restlessness a narrative engine. If the gods are uneasy, perhaps they are not merely distributing punishment or changing jurisdiction. Perhaps they are bracing. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated and the evidence is suggestive at best. Yet the emotional power of the idea comes from its reversal. We expect gods to be the final refuge. The rumour imagines them looking for one. The mood grows stranger when you imagine the temple not just as a place of worship, but as a station of presence. Lamps lit offerings, arranged hymns spoken, doors opened in sequence, all with the expectation that the divine order remains accessible. Most historians agree that these rituals reinforce social and cosmic stability, but one interpretation is that ritual precision also serves another emotional purpose. It keeps panic at bay. It says the world still works because the pattern still holds. You wash, offer, chant, tally, bow, and repeat. It is ancient bureaucracy with incense, and honestly, that may be the most human detail of all. So the restlessness of the gods is not dramatic because it breaks a fantasy world. It is dramatic because it threatens an administrative world, a daily world, a world of bread, storage, jars, reeds, fish, labour, and whispered prayers. If divine motion becomes unpredictable, then everything below it, trembles a little. The evidence we do have points to a culture deeply invested in preserving order precisely because order is never automatic. That is the grounded truth. But if the language of divine movement sometimes feels more urgent than decorative, it raises the possibility that these texts are doing more than praising power. They may also be circling anxiety. You feel that anxiety now, not as panic, but as a low hum beneath the hymns. The gods of Sumer and their later interpreters remain majestic, but perhaps not entirely comfortable. They hold authority, yet the old stories occasionally give them the air of beings who know the map may not be complete. And if that sounds too modern, too psychological, let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts may not be describing divine fear in any literal sense, but they may be preserving a human intuition that power, even sacred power, does not cancel uncertainty. Sometimes it only makes uncertainty more ceremonial. So you keep walking between temple walls and night air, listening to the silence between the praises. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian gods structure the cosmos of city life. A careful reading might suggest that some of their movements sound less like pageantry and more like unease. And what if somewhere beneath the official calm, the old stories are already hinting that someone powerful is preparing to go? The sense of preparation grows sharper as you move from the broad life of the gods into the machinery of kingship, because in Sumer, the line between heaven and rule on earth is never cleanly drawn. Most historians agree that kingship in ancient Mesopotamia is bound tightly to divine legitimacy. A ruler may build canals, lead armies, commission temples, settle disputes, and boast with exhausting confidence on inscriptions, but none of that means very much without the sacred frame around it. What's broadly accepted is that kingship is imagined not merely as political power, but as something granted, supported, or at least tolerated by the gods. Archaeology suggests that royal inscriptions, temple foundations, dedicatory objects, and ceremonial architecture all reinforce this relationship. The crown does not sit alone. It sits beneath a sky full of watching authority. You can feel this in the way cities stage power. Temples rise above the neighbourhoods, not just because people enjoy climbing stairs for spiritual cardio, but because elevation means visibility, and visibility means order made physical. The king is not a god in the straightforward Egyptian sense, but he is close enough to divine business that ritual mistakes, military failures, or civic collapse can feel cosmically embarrassing. One interpretation is that myths about divine descent, divine favour, or sacred mandates preserve symbolic ways of talking about rule, legitimacy, and continuity. That is the solid historical path, and it explains a great deal. But a careful reading might suggest that the stories often carry another shade as well. The power granted from above sometimes feels less like a serene gift, and more like a torch passed under pressure. Think of the old Sumerian idea that kingship descends from heaven. Most historians agree that this is part of the literary and ideological framework visible in traditions like the Sumerian king list, where rulership is presented as something originating beyond the human sphere. What's broadly accepted is not that a literal throne drops from the clouds with celestial upholstery, but that the phrase expresses sacred legitimacy. Rule is not invented by men in a courtyard debate over lunch. It is rooted in divine order. That is how authority becomes more than force. It becomes destiny with paperwork. And yet even that phrase, kingship descending from heaven, carries a strange dramatic charge. One interpretation is that it simply elevates political authority. A more cautious explanation could be that it also reflects a world deeply aware that order must come from somewhere beyond immediate chaos. Human communities do not trust themselves enough to generate lasting legitimacy unaided, so they imagine it descending. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another question appears in the half-light. Why does sacred order keep needing to descend at all? Why must it be reinstalled, reaffirmed, repaired and staged so often? Historians still argue whether the repeated emphasis on divine support for kingship reflects actual instability in political succession, literary convention, or deeper social anxiety about fragility. That debate matters because Sumerian city-states compete constantly. Their alliances shift, their rulers rise and fall. Temple and palace interests overlap, cooperate, and sometimes strain against each other. Archaeology suggests a world of impressive organisation, yes, but also one of frequent contest. A king may present himself as beloved by a deity today and rubble adjacent tomorrow. Ancient politics has the emotional durability of wet bread. So when myths and hymns portray authority as arriving from above, modern readers sometimes notice a subtle tension. The sacred source of kingship should make the system feel secure, yet the texts often work very hard to keep reasserting that connection, which may hint at how unstable the lived reality can be. One interpretation is that divine endorsement functions as a repair mechanism for political uncertainty. If the city trembles, the ritual language grows louder. If succession is messy, inscriptions become more elegant. If rivals threaten your rule, suddenly the gods have written you the warmest letter of recommendation in history. This is where the mood of escape begins to brush against the institution of kingship. Not as proof, and certainly not as some neat hidden code, but as texture. If the gods in these stories are themselves moving, withholding, descending or withdrawing, then kingship tied to them takes on a slightly haunted quality. The ruler becomes not just the recipient of sacred order, but the caretaker of something that may already be slipping. What's broadly accepted is that kingship language is theological and political. A careful reading might suggest that it is also defensive, trying to nail divine stability in place before it drifts. A fringe idea proposes that myths of rule descending from heaven preserve a dim cultural memory of guidance from powerful non-human beings during a time of upheaval. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians would say quite reasonably that the language belongs to mythic statecraft, not hidden visitors with administrative ambitions. Still, the fringe idea lingers because it flips the emotional direction of the story. If the bearers of order come from above, maybe they do so not only to govern, but because they too are arriving from somewhere unsettled. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clues remain literary as much as historical. In Mesopotamian imagination, earthly rule mirrors divine order, but mirrors can also reveal cracks. If the heavens are perfectly settled, kingship on earth ought to feel calm, inevitable, and well-centred. Sometimes it does, but sometimes the language of divine assembly verdict favour and withdrawal suggests a cosmic system that requires constant negotiation. Scholars continue to debate how much of that reflects theology, how much reflects politics, and how much is simply the poetic habit of dramatising authority. There's no full consensus, which is exactly why the mood stays interesting. You begin to notice how kings stand at thresholds. They are between city and god labour and ritual field and temple warfare and offering. They build walls, dig canals, dedicate statues and perform devotion with all the intensity of men who know their careers depend on invisible approval. Archaeology suggests that kings invested heavily in temple construction and restoration because sacred architecture anchored legitimacy. A temple is not just a building, it is a public statement that the channel between heaven and earth remains open. One interpretation is that massive building projects express piety and power. Another is that they also soothe fear. If the god's house is repaired, perhaps the bond still holds. If the ziggurat rises, maybe order has not left town just yet. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not literal fleeing rulers from outer darkness, not a secret invasion in reverse, but a more subtle idea. Perhaps the repeated staging of divine legitimacy preserves the sensation that order is always arriving under pressure. The crown glitters, the rituals proceed, the hymns praise the god, the people bow, the scribes record it all, and still the texts whisper that none of this is automatic. Sacred authority comes down, but it may also be passing through. It may be shelter, but it may also be transit. That possibility gives the old formula an unexpected loneliness. Kingship descends from heaven, yes, but heaven itself, in Mesopotamian literature, is not always the still polished place later imaginations prefer. It can be layered, social contested, full of decrees, omens, assemblies, and decisions. A more cautious explanation could be that this complexity simply reflects human institutions projected upward. But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and if imagination begins to glow around the edges, we will keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So you stand beside the king, now hearing the priest recite, smelling bitumen and incense, watching banners stir in hot air, and you understand why sacred rule feels so dramatic here. Most historians agree that Sumerian kingship is inseparable from divine legitimacy. One interpretation is that myths of descent from above preserve symbolic memories of authority arriving during crisis. And what if the crown carries hidden beneath its gold and polished language the hush of something borrowed from a sky that does not feel entirely safe? The hush above the crown follows you into deeper water because once kingship has descended from heaven, the next thing waiting in the old Mesopotamian imagination is the flood. Most historians agree that flood traditions in Mesopotamian literature are rooted at least in part in the lived reality of river civilizations. The Tigris and Euphrates nourish cities' fields, canals, orchards and trade, but they also overflow shift-course damaged settlements and remind everyone that nature does not honour your filing system. Archaeology suggests that southern Mesopotamia experiences real episodes of flooding and environmental instability, though not in one single neat event that solves every myth like a tidy detective ending. What's broadly accepted is that flood stories grow from a world where water is both giver and threat. You do not need much imagination to understand why. You live on a flat plain. Your city rises from mud brick. Your grain stores depend on timing. Your canals require maintenance. Too little water and the fields suffer. Too much and the streets become a brown soup of damaged panic and very disappointed goats. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian flood narratives become powerful because they magnify familiar danger into cosmic scale. That is the strong historical anchor. But one interpretation is that over time, those stories gather more than weather. They begin to hold memory itself, layered fear, repeated crisis, and the uneasy sense that disaster rarely arrives alone. The evidence we do have points to several flood traditions across Mesopotamian literature, including the version preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives a divine decision to wipe out humankind. Most historians agree that the Gilgamesh flood narrative shares deep connections with older Mesopotamian storytelling and later traditions elsewhere in the ancient Near East. What's broadly accepted is not that every detail records an eyewitness report from the dawn of time, but that flood memory becomes one of the great literary vessels of human vulnerability. Water rises, order collapses, the ordinary world vanishes, and what remains afterward feels both familiar and irreversibly altered. And yet, the divine side of these stories is where tonight's mood becomes especially interesting. In the Mesopotamian flood tradition, the gods are not always calm directors of fate. They deliberate, decide, regret, panic, and in some versions react with emotion that feels surprisingly close to human distress. One interpretation is that this dramatizes divine justice and divine ambivalence within a richly mythic framework. That is sensible, grounded, and likely correct as far as literary function goes. But a careful reading might suggest that the gods themselves do not appear untouched by the catastrophe they unleash or permit. Their authority remains, but their composure sometimes flickers. Historians still argue whether these divine emotional scenes should be read mainly as poetic device theological reflection or evidence of how ancient communities imagined cosmic power under strain. The debate matters because Mesopotamian myth does not always portray the divine as sleek and untroubled. The gods can be grand, yes, but they can also seem alarmed by the consequences of their own decisions, as if power does not fully protect them from the scale of what has been set in motion. If that sounds odd for gods, welcome to ancient literature where even immortals occasionally behave like committee members who approved the plan and are now quietly regretting the meeting notes. What's broadly accepted is that floods become symbols of judgment, destruction, reset, and survival. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another layer appears. Perhaps flood memory also becomes a stage on which older fears gather. Not just fear of water, but fear of instability so vast that even the sacred order seems forced into reaction. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how myth enlarges human crisis. When disaster exceeds ordinary language, the gods themselves must enter the scene and tremble a little so the story can hold the weight. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else? We are not proving anything tonight, and the evidence is thin where speculation begins, but the pattern is worth noticing. In some readings, the flood becomes the most visible danger, the one everyone remembers and retells, yet the emotional atmosphere around it can suggest a broader instability in the divine human world. If powerful beings are deciding, moving, warning, regretting, hiding, or surviving, perhaps the flood is not the only thing anyone is trying to outrun. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it belongs more to interpretation than documentation, but it casts a long shadow. A fringe idea proposes that flood stories preserve distorted memory of a larger upheaval that frightened even the beings later remembered as gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has staying power because it takes an already dramatic narrative and tilts it sideways. The flood in that reading is not merely punishment or cleansing. It is collateral weather around a deeper crisis. Most historians would reject that as speculative, and fairly so. The evidence we do have points much more strongly to environmental experience, literary tradition, and theological storytelling. But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and if imagination wanders, we'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You can feel the pull of that distinction as you picture the ark-like vessel drifting over black water beneath a dim sky. The mainstream reading says this is a mythic survival tale shaped by real ecological fear, scribal tradition, and ritual imagination. One interpretation is that the flood becomes a language for all-overwhelming collapse. And what if, just at the edges of the frame, there lingers the unsettling idea that some of the highest figures in the story are reacting not with omniscient serenity, but with the hurried dignity of those who did not expect the storm to become so large? Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamian communities rebuild again and again after damage, disruption, and political change. This matters because flood stories do not belong only to endings. They belong to recovery. Mud dries, bricks are remade, fields are remeasured, temples are restored, names are written again into clay. Most historians agree that this cycle of destruction and rebuilding is one reason Mesopotamian literature feels so resilient. It does not imagine order as permanent. It imagines order as something painfully reassembled. And maybe that is why the flood remains so compelling. It is not simply a tale of ruin, it is a memory of how thin the line is between system and surge. So the older fear may not be one event, it may be recurrence itself. The river rises again, the walls crack again, the city prays again, the scribes press signs into fresh clay again. Historians still argue whether flood stories should be read primarily as mythic theology or as cultural memory rooted in repeated environmental trauma. The truth is that they may be both. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And that leaves you with a more haunting possibility than any simple doomsday reading. Maybe the flood matters so much in these texts not because it explains everything, but because it teaches the old civilization how to imagine pressure. Pressure from water, pressure from fate, pressure from the gods, and perhaps in the most speculative mood of all, pressure even on the gods themselves. Most historians agree that flood traditions reflect real ecological and literary foundations. A careful reading might suggest that later versions also carry the memory of repeated instability. And what if in those dark waters the old stories are whispering that the flood is only the part of the fear humans could see? The water recedes, but the feeling does not. It clings like damp reed fibres to the next set of clues. Because once you begin noticing instability in flood stories, you also begin noticing something else in the tablets themselves, an odd repetition of departure. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scribes preserve an enormous range of texts, including myths, hymns, laments, administrative records, king lists, omen collections, lexical lists, and ritual material. What's broadly accepted is that these tablets do not form one neat master narrative with a secret answer hidden in the back, like a puzzle magazine. They are products of many centuries, cities, scribal schools, and political moments. Archaeology suggests continuity, adaptation, and careful copying, but also change, overlap, and reinterpretation. In other words, the archive is rich, but it is not tidy. And that is exactly why certain patterns matter less as proof and more as mood. A careful reading might suggest that across many texts, one recurring emotional motif is abandonment or withdrawal. Gods leave cities. Divine favour shifts. Temples are emptied in literary imagination. Sacred order is described as disrupted, delayed, or painfully restored. One interpretation is that this is the natural language of a civilization repeatedly facing war, political collapse, dynastic change, and ecological pressure. That is a strong explanation, and usually the best one. But what if the story is pointing at something else? Not a hidden confession, not a secret code, but a repeated sensation. Someone important keeps moving away. You notice this first in the simple fact that Mesopotamian religion is full of journeys. Gods travel. Their cult statues may be imagined or ritually treated as present beings who can be installed, removed, carried, restored, or mourned in absence. Most historians agree that divine movement in the texts often reflects ritual politics, theological symbolism, or the realities of conquest and temple plunder. If one city defeats another and takes a cult statue that can have enormous religious meaning, divine presence is not merely philosophical, it is local, social, embodied in ritual space. So when a god departs, even in literary form, it lands like a civic wound. The evidence we do have points to scribes caring deeply about this problem. They record laments over ruined cities. They preserve hymns celebrating restoration. They narrate divine anger, reconciliation, and return. What's broadly accepted is that these works help communities interpret crisis. If the city falls, the god must have left. If the temple is desecrated, sacred order must be damaged. A more cautious explanation could be that the literature translates human catastrophe into divine drama, because that is how collective grief becomes narratable. It is easier in some ways to say that the goddess departed than to say the walls failed, the allies vanished, the grain ran out, and the soldiers did not come back. Still, the pattern of departure can feel almost too emotionally consistent to ignore. The gods do not only punish, they withdraw. They are absent when needed most. They move to other cities. They become distant. In some texts, that distance hurts more than open wrath. Rage at least acknowledges you. Silence is much ruder. One interpretation is that this deepens the theology of dependence. Humans are fragile, not because the gods are cruel, but because divine nearness cannot be guaranteed. That is a powerful and very human religious insight. Yet a careful reading might suggest another layer beneath it, the sense that departure itself becomes a central drama of the civilization. Historians still argue whether these repeated literary departures should be read mostly as standard theological language, as reflections of political instability, or as evidence of more deeply rooted cultural anxiety. That debate matters because once a motif appears across genres, it becomes more than ornament. It becomes habit, and habits in literature often tell you what a society fears losing. In Mesopotamia, it is not only crops, walls, labour and kings. It is presence. It is access. It is the feeling that the centre still holds. A fringe idea proposes that these repeated divine departures hint at the Anunnaki or other high beings retreating from something larger than human conflict. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains attractive because it organises scattered moments into one dramatic possibility. If the gods are always leaving, perhaps they are not only judging cities or following ritual logic, perhaps they are repositioning. Perhaps the literary motif of abandonment preserves in highly distorted form a memory of beings in motion for reasons no human scribe fully understood. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated and the evidence is far too thin to treat as conclusion. But the emotional pattern is real even if its cause remains open. You can imagine the scribe at work now, not as a mystical oracle with wind in his beard and cosmic secrets dripping from every stylus, but as a trained professional in a room that smells faintly of clay oil and effort. He copies old lines. He learns proper forms. He preserves names, formulas, laments and journeys. Most historians agree that scribal culture in Mesopotamia is conservative in the best and most stubborn sense. Texts survive because generations cared enough to teach them. A more cautious explanation could be that departures seem so common in the archive because scribal memory itself is drawn to rupture. Crises are copied because crises matter. Restoration songs are written because people cannot bear silence without pattern. And yet, the departures keep their eerie quality. A god leaves a sanctuary. A goddess withdraws favour. A sacred bond loosens. A city becomes empty in both practical and spiritual language. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know these texts reflect real cycles of devastation and recovery. We know they are shaped by theology, politics, and literary convention. What we cannot confirm is whether the emotional tone carries anything beyond those frameworks. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a strange dramatic picture begins to form. The old stories are full of exits. Not grand triumphant exits either. Often these departures feel sorrowful, reluctant, tense, or haunting. They leave behind echoing temples, grieving communities, and ritual attempts at repair. Most historians agree that this aligns well with the experience of city destruction and political upheaval. The evidence we do have points to real trauma behind many of these laments. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if, in literary terms at least, departure is not only judgment, but fear translated into ritual language? Not fear we can name clearly, but the older and stranger fear that even your protectors are not settled. There is a reason this matters for tonight's larger puzzle. If the Anunnaki and related divine figures are to be read in mainstream terms, then their movements belong to mythic order moral drama and the sacred geography of cities. That remains the safest reading. But one interpretation is that repeated departures and abandonments create a cumulative pattern of unease. The gods do not simply travel. They seem hard to keep. Their nearness is unstable. Their presence requires maintenance. Their absence leaves emotional weather behind. And perhaps that is the most revealing detail of all. Ancient Mesopotamian texts do not describe a universe where sacred order once appears and then sits politely in place forever. They describe a universe where order must return, be restored, be invited, be honoured, be housed, be sung back into relation. The temple is repaired. The rites resume. The clay is pressed again. The god is praised again. Ancient life, as usual, is one long negotiation with reality, just with better hymns and fewer ergonomic chairs. So you sit with the tablets now, not as codebooks for a hidden truth, but as rooms full of anxious echoes. Most historians agree that scribes preserve myths, laments, and divine journeys with extraordinary care. A careful reading might suggest that repeated departures and abandonments create a pattern of unease. And what if just behind the ritual language there lingers the unsettling possibility that escape has been hiding in plain sight, disguised for centuries as sacred travel? The idea of sacred travel now draws you toward one of the most important places in the Mesopotamian religious landscape, because if you want to understand how order is imagined, defended and mourned, you eventually arrive at Nippur. Most historians agree that Nippur holds an exceptional status in Sumerian tradition as a sacred centre associated above all with Enlil, one of the chief deities of the Mesopotamian pantheon. What's broadly accepted is that Nippur is not simply another city competing for grain prestige and wall thickness. It carries unusual symbolic authority. Archaeology suggests that its sanctuary, the Ekur, is treated as a central house of divine order, a place where cosmic legitimacy and earthly rulership intersect in especially powerful ways. If cities are chapters, Nippur feels like the binding. You can sense why almost immediately. Nippur is not necessarily the loudest city in every political moment, nor always the wealthiest or militarily dominant, but its sacred gravity is enormous. Kings from different dynasties want association with it. They restore its temples. They praise its sanctity. They seek its blessing like students hovering around the strict teacher, whose approval somehow matters more than all the others put together. Most historians agree that this points to the city's role in legitimizing kingship and connecting rule to divine order. What's broadly accepted is that to be in right relation with Nippur and with Enlil through Nippur is to stand closer to the centre of what the cosmos is supposed to be doing. And that is exactly why any sign of instability there feels heavier than elsewhere. If Nippur represents order, then disruption. In Nippur is not just local trouble, it becomes symbolic trouble. One interpretation is that texts concerning Nippur, its temple and Enlil's favour preserve the emotional pressure of trying to keep the universe arranged through ritual architecture and proper rule. That is a very grounded explanation. A more cautious explanation could be that the sacred centrality of Nippur intensifies every anxiety around disorder. If the city at the heart trembles, everything on the edges begins to listen. The evidence we do have points to Enlil as a major figure in Sumerian religion, tied to authority, decree, atmosphere, and the shaping of destinies. Most historians agree that he is not a minor local god accidentally inflated by enthusiastic marketing. He matters deeply. His temple matters deeply. Nippur matters deeply. But when literature centres so much weight in one sacred place, it also creates a dramatic vulnerability. The place must hold. The temple must function. The rites must continue. The god must remain present. And if any of that falters, the language of the text can become strikingly tense. Historians still argue whether laments and disrupted order texts tied to major sacred centres are best read as responses to specific political collapses, as theological reflections on suffering, or as literary forms that dramatise fragility in deliberately heightened ways. The debate matters because Nippur's symbolic importance means that even routine damage or decline can acquire cosmic colouring in scribal memory. A cracked wall is never just a cracked wall when it belongs to the House of Order. It becomes a line in the face of the world. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion imagines order as something decreed and maintained, not passively guaranteed. That becomes especially vivid in Nippur. The city's sacred identity suggests that reality itself has structure, hierarchy, and authorization. But a careful reading might suggest that texts about disturbed order sometimes carry emotional traces of deeper divine anxiety. Not fear in a simple modern sense perhaps, but tension, pressure, the sense that cosmic balance is less like a settled throne and more like a great weight held in place by ritual memory and repeated acts of repair. You can picture the Ekhor now in the fading light, its courts and thresholds heavy with expectation. Priests move with measured discipline. Offerings are prepared. Incantations are spoken. The smell of oil, grain dust and smoke mingles under the airless heat. Most historians agree that such temples were central institutions, not merely symbolic shells. They organised labour property and sacred activity. A more cautious explanation could be that their daily precision helped people feel that the world still operated by intelligible rules. Light the lamp, speak the words, carry the vessel, record the ration. Ancient civilization is often just elaborate reassurance with better brickwork. And yet, reassurance only matters when something threatens it. That is the mood you begin to catch in the literature of order and its disruption. If Nippur stands at the centre, then its symbolic calm may also mask the pressure placed upon it. One interpretation is that this pressure reflects entirely human conditions: war, dynastic struggle, environmental stress, interrupted ritual life, and the ordinary catastrophe of history behaving like history. That is the solid ground. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if some of the old tension in these texts comes from the intuition that even divine order has to brace itself? A fringe idea proposes that the great sacred centres of Mesopotamia, especially those most associated with cosmic decree, preserve literary echoes of a larger celestial instability. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is very thin. Most historians would say reasonably that the disturbances in Nippur's literary world arise from political and ritual crisis, not from gods nervously checking the horizon. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the atmosphere shifts. The House of Order begins to sound less like an invulnerable fortress and more like a sanctuary built against something pressing from beyond the walls. That possibility becomes strangely potent when you remember how often ancient literature speaks in tones of loss and restoration. Order is broken, then restored. Favour departs, then returns. Temples are damaged, then rebuilt. The evidence we do have points to a civilization accustomed to cycles of disruption. Most historians agree that this is one reason Mesopotamian texts feel so emotionally mature. They do not expect permanence. They expect maintenance. Nippur in this reading is not powerful because it ends uncertainty. It is powerful because it offers a place to face uncertainty with ritual form. Still, a careful reading might suggest that the calm language of sacred order sometimes sounds like someone speaking softly around a cracked wall. That is not proof of hidden terror. It is not evidence that Enlil or the Anunnaki were literally fleeing a cosmic predator with excellent timing and poor manners. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It is evidence that the texts themselves understand order as precious because it is fragile. And once you notice that the old stories begin to glow differently, the divine is still authoritative, but it is not always effortless. Presence must be renewed. The centre must be guarded. The pattern must be repeated. Scholars continue to debate how much theological nuance we should hear in these motifs and how much belongs simply to the realities of city-state religion under pressure. There's no full consensus, And that uncertainty is part of the point. We are following clues, not collecting certainties. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. So you remain in Nippur a little longer, listening to footsteps in the courts of the Ikur, hearing the low chant, watching shadows gather at the edges of the sacred centre. Most historians agree that Nippur matters enormously as a city tied to Enlil and cosmic balance. One interpretation is that texts about disrupted order there may carry emotional traces of deeper divine anxiety. And what if the empire of the gods sounds calm only because everyone, human and divine alike, is speaking softly around a wall they do not entirely trust? The wall you do not entirely trust now becomes a gate, because once sacred order starts to feel fragile, the old stories begin leading you toward thresholds, descents, and places where even divine confidence seems to thin out. That is how you arrive at Inanna. Most historians agree that Inanna, later identified with Ishtar in Akkadian tradition, is one of the most vivid and complex deities in Mesopotamian religion, associated with love, sexuality, power, kingship, conflict, and celestial identity. What's broadly accepted is that her myths are layered, theatrical, and deeply important. Archaeology suggests her cult is widespread and influential, and the literary tradition around her is among the richest in the ancient Near East. She is not a quiet background goddess. She enters every room like she owns the architecture. And yet, one of her most famous stories is not about triumph in the simple sense. It is about descent. In the tale, often called the Descent of Inanna, she goes down into the underworld, passing through gates, surrendering symbols of power one by one, and confronting a realm where the rules are colder, older, and not especially interested in negotiation. Most historians agree that this myth has ritual, theological, and literary significance, though scholars continue to debate its exact meanings and functions. One interpretation is that it reflects cycles of fertility, death renewal, or sacred transformation. A more cautious explanation could be that the story dramatizes the stripping away of status before an unavoidable boundary that is already haunting enough without adding anything extra. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another mood begins to gather. The descent may also symbolize an encounter with forces even the gods do not easily master. That is not a mainstream claim in a literal sense, and we should be careful. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, the story itself gives you that sensation. Inanna does not stroll downward like a queen inspecting a new summer property. She is checked, halted, reduced, exposed. The gates matter. The removal of garments and regalia matters. The underworld is not merely another district under divine management. It feels like a zone of older gravity. Historians still argue whether the descent myth should be read mainly through ritual symbolism, gendered power, cosmic geography, political theology, or literary drama. The debate matters because the story refuses to shrink into one clean meaning. It is too strange, too elegant, too unsettling. What's broadly accepted is that descent narratives in Mesopotamia operate on several levels at once. But a careful reading might suggest that this one preserves a rare theological mood. Even a great goddess can enter a domain where her usual forms of authority do not function. That mood matters for tonight's puzzle because it complicates the image of divine power. If the gods are all perfectly secure within one unified cosmic order, descent is simply a narrative device. But if Mesopotamian literature occasionally hints that the cosmos contains zones of real danger, older law, or stubborn limit, then descent becomes more than symbolism. It becomes rehearsal. It becomes the story form through which a civilization imagines contact with what cannot be easily ruled. You can feel it in the gates. Each threshold takes something from her. Crown beads, garments, authority, display. One interpretation is that this enacts ritual humbling or transformation. Another is that it expresses the ancient truth that every crossing costs you something. Most historians agree that such symbolic stripping is central to the tale's power. And frankly, it is also the ancient world's least subtle way of saying the universe does not care about your title. Very rude, but effective. What's broadly accepted is that the underworld in Mesopotamian thought is not a cheerful realm of moral sorting with harps in the background. It is dim, dusty, inevitable, and not widely recommended as a vacation destination. The evidence we do have points to a conception of death and the netherworld as shadowy, constrained, and deeply serious. A more cautious explanation could be that descent myths reflect human confrontation with mortality, grief, and irreversible change. That is strong-grounded and enough to explain much of the story's emotional force. Still, what if the story is pointing at something else as well? Not literal alien panic, not a secret cosmic war hidden in a fertility myth, but the intuition that the universe contains levels even divine beings approach carefully. A fringe idea proposes that descent stories preserve distorted memories of encounters with powers greater than the named gods of the city pantheons. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians would say, quite sensibly, that the myth is about ritual drama, cosmic order and death. But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and if imagination stirs, we'll keep it labelled as imagination. Even without the fringe, reading the story creates a striking theological possibility. Divine authority in Mesopotamian literature may be immense, but it is not always portrayed as unlimited in every domain. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Yet it helps explain why descent narratives feel so charged. Inanna's journey is memorable not because she goes somewhere strange, but because the strangeness resists her. The underworld is not impressed. The gates do not flatter. The old order below demands terms. Scholars continue to debate whether this reflects competing divine jurisdictions, ancient ritual logic, or the literary pleasure of watching power tested at its edges. There's no full consensus, but a careful reading might suggest that the story trains its audience to imagine thresholds as serious places. Heaven, earth, underworld, city, temple, throne, gate. Everything important in Mesopotamian thought is crossed through forms, permissions, sequences, and loss. You never simply arrive. You are processed. Ancient theology, as usual, has a suspicious amount in common with institutional paperwork. And once you notice that the larger atmosphere changes, if great gods can be checked at gates, stripped of symbols, delayed, threatened, or confined, then the sacred universe is not a smooth hierarchy of effortless command. It is layered, procedural, and at times unnervingly resistant. Most historians agree that this is part of what makes Mesopotamian myth so sophisticated. It imagines power, but it also imagines limit. One interpretation is that journeys downward symbolize contact with forces even the gods do not easily master. That may be too strong if stated as fact, so let me rephrase that more carefully. The myths may preserve a mood in which some boundaries remain dangerous, even for divine figures. That mood matters because it makes the idea of escape newly plausible in literary terms. Not escape as a documented event, but escape as a recurring emotional grammar. If there are thresholds no one crosses lightly, if there are realms older than display and rank, then stories of departure, withdrawal, and caution among the gods begin to sound less decorative. They sound practiced. They sound like beings who know better than to move casually through an unstable cosmos. So you watch Inanna at the gates, one emblem at a time, laid aside, and you understand why this myth lingers. Most historians agree that descent stories serve ritual, theological, and literary purposes. A careful reading might suggest that journeys downward also symbolize encounters with forces even the gods do not easily master? And what if every gate in these old stories opens onto the same quiet suspicion that somewhere beyond the ranked world of temples and crowns, something larger is waiting patient and unimpressed? The gates close softly behind you, and when you look upward again, the sky no longer feels like a simple place of reassurance. It feels layered, observed, and slightly tense, which is exactly the right mood for turning from descent to the heavens above. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion pays close attention to the sky. Stars, planets, eclipses, storms, the moon and the sun are not casual background details, but meaningful parts of a sacred and intellectual world. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamians developed sophisticated traditions of celestial observation over time, especially in later periods, and that omens connected to the heavens play a major role in royal decision-making and religious interpretation. Archaeology suggests continuity between early cosmological thinking and later scholarly systems, even if the details evolve across centuries and languages. The sky is not empty, it is legible, or at least everyone hopes it is. That hope matters, because the heavens in Mesopotamian thought are not merely beautiful. They are structured, authoritative, and sometimes unsettling. Most historians agree that the cosmos is imagined in layered ways, with heavens above earth, in the middle and underworld below, though scholars continue to debate how literally or consistently such models should be read across different texts. One interpretation is that celestial order gives human beings a way to think about divine regularity. The stars move, the moon returns, the seasons shift, the sky becomes the grandest example of patterned stability. That is the mainstream safe understanding, and it makes perfect sense. But a careful reading might suggest that the sky is not always presented as comfortable. It is also a place of omens, warnings, unusual signs, and decisions not fully understood below. The evidence we do have points to a culture deeply invested in watching the heavens for meaning, not simply admiring them for aesthetic purposes. If an eclipse comes, it matters. If a planet appears in a certain way, it matters. If thunder rolls at the wrong time, it matters. Ancient life does not really allow for shrugging and saying, "Well, that's interesting." Someone always has to ask what it means, usually before a king starts sweating in public. This is where the mood of divine restlessness begins to tilt upward. If the gods are associated with celestial domains, if authority is mirrored in the heavens, and if heavenly signs can carry threats as well as order, then the sky itself becomes a place of ambiguity. One interpretation is that this reflects the practical needs of divination and royal governance. The king must know whether the gods favour a campaign, a building project, or a diplomatic move. A more cautious explanation could be that omen systems exist because the ancient world is unpredictable and people want pattern badly enough to build an entire scholarly tradition around it. That is solid ground. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if the beings from above are not only sending messages through the sky, but also watching it with unease? Historians still argue whether celestial language in early Mesopotamian myth should be linked directly to later omen science, or treated more separately as symbolic theology. The debate matters because it keeps you honest. You cannot simply collapse every star reference into one grand theory and call it a revelation. The texts are too varied, the chronology too long, and the scribal traditions too complex. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What's broadly accepted is that celestial deities and heavenly symbolism carry authority, shamash. The sun god is linked to justice. Nana, the moon god, shapes sacred and calendrical rhythms. Inanna herself has celestial associations. The heavens are not distant decoration, but part of divine governance. Yet the same sky that signals order can also signal disruption, eclipses strange appearances, and astronomical irregularities can be read as warnings, especially in later Mesopotamian scholarship. A careful reading might suggest that the sacred sky is not only the seat of rule, it is also a field of alertness. A fringe idea proposes that uneasy astronomical language in Mesopotamian tradition preserves memory of fear rather than mastery, as though the gods themselves are reacting to something above or beyond their usual order. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. Most historians would point instead to divination's symbolic kingship and the practical need to interpret celestial events within a religious framework. That is the stronger explanation. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the emotional atmosphere changes. The sky no longer looks like a polished ceiling, it looks like an active frontier. You can feel why that idea has such staying power in modern imagination. Human beings like to believe the gods, if they exist, are comfortably in charge of the upper floors. But Mesopotamian literature is often more interesting than that. It gives you divine assemblies, decrees, omens, journeys, and occasional disruptions. It gives you a heaven that is ordered, yes, but not always tranquil. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the heavens are central to Mesopotamian religion. We know celestial signs matter. We know later scholars catalogue the sky with extraordinary care. What we cannot confirm is whether the emotional tone of certain myths carries an older intuition that the heavens themselves are not entirely secure. Most historians agree that the ancient sky invites both wonder and caution. It regulates time, supports ritual calendars, and provides a framework for interpreting events. One interpretation is that celestial order reassures communities that the cosmos still has structure, but a more cautious explanation could be that the obsession with signs reveals anxiety rather than peace. You do not watch the sky that closely if you are completely relaxed. You watch it because you suspect it knows something before you do. And honestly, this is one of the more relatable habits in ancient religion. It is basically doom scrolling, but with planets. Scholars continue to debate how much theological emotion we should hear in celestial texts. There's no full consensus. Some readings emphasize power, majesty, and divine regularity. Others notice how often heavenly signs are treated as alerts, warnings, or disturbances requiring interpretation. Both can be true. The heavens can represent order and still provoke nervous attention. That tension matters for tonight's larger puzzle, because if the sky itself is an arena of signals and uncertainty, then stories of divine movement begin to sound different. A god leaving a city, descending to another realm, or shifting favour may not simply be following ceremony. In literary terms, at least such motion may belong to a universe where even the upper realms require caution. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a possibility, not a certainty. The safest reading remains theological symbolism shaped by human fear, environmental uncertainty, and royal politics. But if imagination is allowed a dim lamp in the corner, you can picture the old heavens not as silent perfection, but as a place watched by everyone, gods included. Not because disaster is guaranteed, but because uncertainty is built into the order itself. So you stand beneath the Mesopotamian night now, where stars glitter over canals and temple roofs, and what seems calm from a distance begins to feel more alert when you listen closely. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion imagines layered heavens, stars, omens, and celestial authority. A fringe idea proposes that uneasy astronomical language may reflect fear rather than mastery. And what if the beings from above, for all their titles and splendour, are gazing into the same dark with the same low discomfort as the humans below, just with better jewellery and far more official-sounding names? That low discomfort sharpens when you leave the stars themselves and turn to the people whose job is to read them, because a sky full of signs only becomes truly unsettling once someone starts writing them down. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures, especially in later periods, building on earlier traditions, develop extensive omen literature that links celestial events, weather births, animal behaviour, ritual, mishaps, and all sorts of earthly oddities to possible outcomes. What's broadly accepted is that these omen series are not random superstition scribbled in a panic after lunch. They are organised, patterned scholarly efforts to map uncertainty. The evidence we do have points to a learned tradition in which priests, diviners and scribes treat signs as meaningful clues about royal fate, public danger and cosmic mood. In other words, ancient Mesopotamia does not merely fear chaos, it catalogues it. You can picture the scene with almost embarrassing clarity. A scribe bends over clay stylus in hand, while somewhere outside a dog barks a cartwheel, groans, and a worried official waits to hear whether an eclipse means delay your campaign or cancel your entire confidence. Most historians agree that omen interpretation becomes an important part of statecraft, especially where kingship and divine favour are tightly linked. A more cautious explanation could be that these systems emerge because uncertainty is exhausting, and human beings would rather live in a world of difficult signs than in a world of no signs at all. If something strange happens, at least you can classify it. Ancient bureaucracy once again appears ready to meet your emotional needs with a numbered list. What's broadly accepted is that omen texts can be astonishingly detailed. If this appears, then that may follow. If the moon behaves thus, then some political consequence may occur. If an animal is born with a certain feature, then perhaps an enemy threat or crop issue lies ahead. One interpretation is that this is a rational attempt within its cultural framework to domesticate unpredictability. The world becomes less terrifying when it can be read. Archaeology suggests that such interpretive systems are part of a broader scribal culture that values order, repetition and preservation. The same people who tally grain and copy epics also preserve methods for handling cosmic nerves. And nerves are the key word here. A careful reading might suggest that the very existence of vast omen catalogues reveals a culture trying to manage uncertainty at every level. That does not make Mesopotamians uniquely anxious. It makes them human only with better archives. Still, the scale of the effort matters. These are not casual folk sayings about birds flying left. These are elaborate systems connecting heaven-earth, kingship, weather, and ritual life into one interpretive net. Most historians agree that this reflects a worldview in which the cosmos is meaningful and interconnected. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if the endless catalogue of signs feels less like confidence and more like nervous note-taking before a train no one can stop? Historians still argue whether omen literature should be understood primarily as religious science, political technology, psychological reassurance, or all three at once. The debate matters because each angle changes the emotional tone. If omen reading is mainly intellectual craft, the mood is one of skill and order. If it is mainly political, the mood is control. But if it is also psychological, the mood becomes more intimate. The tablets start to sound like ancient attempts to calm a shaking hand. Write it down, name the sign, match it to precedent. Perhaps the world is still legible if enough clay can be pressed into service. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that refuses to leave uncertainty unaddressed. That is one of its great strengths. Yet the same habit can create an eerie aftertaste. A culture fully at ease does not need this many warning systems. One interpretation is that Mesopotamian omen literature reveals extraordinary intellectual confidence. A more cautious explanation could be that it reveals extraordinary exposure. Life is precarious. Kings are vulnerable. Crops fail. Enemies move. Rivers rise. Temples can fall quiet. So the signs must be tracked because not tracking them feels worse. A fringe idea proposes that the sheer intensity of omen culture hints at more than ordinary political and environmental fear, as though ancient people suspected pressure operating at levels even their gods were still negotiating. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. Most historians would say, quite reasonably, that omen systems emerge from divination, theology, and royal administration, not from secret awareness of cosmic fugitives. That is the stronger explanation. Still, if we treat it as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, the atmosphere changes. The tablets begin to look like the paperwork of a civilization listening for something larger than war or weather. That possibility remains speculative, but the emotional logic is easy to understand. If your world feels exposed, every anomaly matters. The moon's edge matters. A bird's cry matters. The shape of smoke matters. The liver of a sacrificed animal matters. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian divination works through exactly this kind of careful reading across many domains. Scholars continue to debate how these systems develop and how ordinary or exceptional they are within the broader ancient world. There's no full consensus on every detail, but no one doubts the seriousness of the enterprise. These people were not casually guessing. They were trying to read a universe that answered in riddles. And riddles can wear down the soul. You begin to imagine how it feels to live inside a sign, saturated reality, where no strange event is merely strange. It must be interpreted. A more cautious explanation could be that this creates social discipline as much as comfort. If kings know signs can warn against bad decisions that shapes behaviour, if priests control interpretation that shapes authority, if scribes preserve outcomes that shapes memory, omen literature is therefore not only mystical, it is administrative, political and cultural glue. Most historians agree that it helps bind cosmic order to public action. Still, the mood remains slightly haunted. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know omen texts are real. We know they are extensive. We know they reflect a world where divine communication is assumed to run through patterns. What we cannot confirm is whether the growing density of signs also reflects the sensation that ordinary explanations are not enough. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not prove anyone feared a hidden superforce beyond the gods, but they may preserve the experience of living as though the edges of reality were always speaking first. If that sounds dramatic, remember that Mesopotamian literature often is. It can be formal, yes, but it is also emotionally frank about fragility. Temples can be abandoned, cities can be lamented, kings can lose favour, heavens can warn. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that never quite mistakes order for safety. Order is precious because danger remains possible. Omen culture fits that mindset perfectly. It is the technology of staying alert. So you sit now among the clay tablets of signs and outcomes, reading the old formulas in the dim light, and the atmosphere grows almost modern in its weary vigilance. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian omen literature links earthly events with cosmic signs through highly organised interpretation. A careful reading might suggest that these systems reveal a culture trying to manage uncertainty at every level. And what if all that endless notation, all those careful if and then lines pressed into wet clay, sound a little less like mastery and a little more like a civilization, quietly documenting its nerves before the next knock at the gate? The knock at the gate becomes louder when the signs are no longer abstract, because after omens and anxious skies, the old literature gives you one of its most powerful emotional forms, the lament. Most historians agree that the city laments of Mesopotamian tradition are among the most moving works to survive from the ancient world. What's broadly accepted is that these compositions mourn real destruction, real displacement, and real political collapse, even though they do so through highly stylized sacred language. Archaeology suggests that cities in southern Mesopotamia do suffer war decline, abandonment, rebuilding, and repeated instability across the centuries. The evidence we do have points to historical trauma standing behind these texts, even when the poems themselves speak with the ceremonial intensity of ritual grief. And grief in these laments is never merely practical. The walls may be broken, the houses emptied, the storehouses ruined, but what makes the poems ache is the sense that divine presence has gone quiet. Gods do not just punish from above. They leave. They withdraw favour. They allow destruction. They become absent in the places where people most need them. One interpretation is that this is the theological language of catastrophe. If a city falls, then in literary and ritual terms, its god must have abandoned it or turned away. That is a mainstream and sensible reading. But a careful reading might suggest that divine absence becomes almost more haunting than the devastation itself. The ruined building hurts, yes. The silent sanctuary hurts worse. You can feel this, especially in the laments over cities like Ur. Most historians agree that such texts likely relate, at least in broad historical memory, to actual episodes of conquest and destruction, even if their literary form reshapes events for ritual and theological purposes. What's broadly accepted is that these laments are not neutral chronicles. They are sorrow organised into sacred speech. A more cautious explanation could be that they help communities endure collapse by placing suffering inside a meaningful cosmic frame. If the goddess weeps, then the people's weeping belongs somewhere. If the god has departed, then the emptiness in the streets is no longer random. It is part of a story, however painful. Still, the emotional texture remains striking. The poems return again and again to houses left empty, sanctuaries, abandoned festivals, interrupted, and divine guardians no longer present. Historians still argue whether the divine departures in city laments should be read primarily as literary theology, ritual drama, or encoded memory of political trauma. The debate matters because the laments do more than describe ruin. They choreograph abandonment. They make absence audible. The city is not just broken, it is deserted by its centre. And once that note enters the ear, it is hard to forget. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is deeply local in expression. Gods belong to cities, temples, cults, and communities. Their presence is not merely philosophical, it is tied to place. So when a lament says the deity has left, the effect is not vague spiritual disappointment, it is civic exposure. The city has been unroofed from the inside. One interpretation is that this gives ritual language to the collapse of social and political order. That is strong ground. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if the silence in abandoned sanctuaries is the sound of powerful beings leaving in a hurry, even if the texts themselves never state that openly? That last thought belongs firmly to interpretation, and rather speculative interpretation at that. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The evidence we do have points much more clearly to warfare, dynastic defeat, and cultural memory of trauma than to fleeing divine entities. Archaeology suggests cities fall for painfully earthly reasons. Armies arrive, economies strain, alliances fail, rivers change, rulers misjudge. The mainstream answer remains enough. But if we treat the mood of the laments as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a second dramatic layer appears. Divine absence no longer reads only as punishment. It begins to resemble retreat. A fringe idea proposes that certain lament traditions preserve echoes of a wider panic among the gods or godlike beings, as though urban collapse below mirrors a withdrawal above. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians would reject it quite fairly as a projection of modern mystery hunting onto ancient grief literature. That is worth saying plainly. But the reason the idea survives is not because the texts prove it. They do not. It survives because the poems themselves are emotionally structured around the unbearable fact of presence becoming absence. Once you write enough lines about empty sacred houses, modern imaginations start asking why the houses were emptied at all. And the old poets knew how to make that question sting. They speak of doors, courts, shrines, processions, and offerings interrupted. They speak of divine favour lifted away. They turn civic disaster into sacred vacancy. Most historians agree that this reflects real experiences of instability transformed by ritual language into forms communities can remember and perform. A more cautious explanation could be that the laments are less about explaining causes than about giving shape to loss. That may be the most human reading of all. People do not always ask first what happened. Sometimes they ask who is gone. Scholars continue to debate how historically specific these laments are, and how much they compress recurring forms of disaster into archetypal language. There's no full consensus. Some see close connections to particular destructions. Others emphasize their literary and ceremonial nature. Both views matter. The laments are rooted in history, but they are designed to outlive one event. That is why their emotional force remains so strong. They capture not just one ruined city, but the recurring ancient fear that order can vanish while the walls still stand. You picture the scene now at dusk, a temple court where footsteps once echoed in ritual sequence lies hushed. The offering table is still there, the incense bowl is still there, dust settles where music used to rise. No one is sure which absence feels worse, the people driven away, or the god no longer thought to dwell there. Most historians agree that the city laments mourn destroyed temples and displaced populations after real political collapse. One interpretation is that divine absence becomes almost as haunting as human suffering. And what if the silence in abandoned sanctuaries is not merely literary sorrow, but the old imagination trying to describe the moment when even the protectors seem to have stepped back from the fire? That possibility is not certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it helps you hear why these poems matter so much for tonight's larger question. If the Anunnaki and the broader divine order are ever imagined as uneasy, then the laments provide the emotional vocabulary for that unease without ever needing to say it directly. They speak in emptied houses, interrupted rites, and missing presence. They do not tell you who fled or why. They simply leave the room echoing. And perhaps that is why the laments feel more unnerving than the omens. A sign warns, a lament confirms the warning came too late. The tablets of omen literature still imagine intervention, interpretation, response. The laments arrive after. They are what remains when the readers were right. The rituals were not enough, and the city wakes to discover that sacred order has thinned into memory. Ancient literature, as usual, knows exactly where to press the bruise. So you linger at the threshold of the empty temple, listening to wind, move through an abandoned sacred house, and the larger pattern grows darker without ever becoming crude. Most historians agree that city laments mourn real destruction and displaced populations after political collapse. A careful reading might suggest that divine absence becomes almost as haunting as human suffering. And what if somewhere behind the mourning, the poems are preserving the oldest and quietest terror of all, that when the walls fell and the cries rose, something powerful had already gone. Something powerful having already gone leaves you with a more difficult problem than simple ruin. Because once the sanctuaries are empty and the laments have spoken, you are left staring at the archive itself, wondering how much of this old unease belongs to history and how much belongs to the way history gets rewritten. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian tradition is not a single unbroken voice. Sumerian material flows into Akkadian contexts later. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes adapt older myths, and over many centuries stories are copied, translated, reorganised and reframed. What's broadly accepted is that continuity exists, but so does layering. The evidence we do have points to a long conversation rather than a locked box, and once you understand that the puzzle becomes less about finding one hidden answer and more about hearing how older anxieties survive beneath newer wording. This matters more than it first appears. A text preserved in a later library may carry old material, later interpretations, editorial adjustments, and the natural wear of generations trying to make inherited stories fit changing worlds. One interpretation is that this layering is exactly why Mesopotamian literature remains so rich. It never stops thinking. A more cautious explanation could be that the same layering also preserves unresolved questions better than any clean summary ever could. When a culture copies old uncertainty forward, it does not erase the unease. It refashions it. The myth survives, but it changes coats and keeps walking. Most historians agree that this is especially important when dealing with divine figures like the Anunnaki, whose functions and associations can shift depending on period and text. What's broadly accepted is that you cannot pull one line from one tablet and use it as a master key for every other version across 1,000 years. That would be convenient, but ancient literature rarely respects your desire for convenience. Archaeology suggests broad themes of continuity in divine hierarchy, sacred geography, and ritual significance, yet the details remain fluid. Gods rise in prominence, merge absorbed traits, shift in relation to each other, or appear in different narrative roles according to context. So when you sense a pattern of unease, you must ask whether it belongs to the earliest layer, the later retelling, or the very human habit of reading anxiety back into older words. Historians still argue whether the apparent tensions in divine narratives reflect real continuity from Sumerian religious imagination into later Mesopotamian traditions, or whether later scribes amplified certain motifs for theological and literary reasons. The debate matters because tonight's story depends on nuance. If the archive were simple, you could declare the mystery solved and go to bed early like a responsible scholar. But it is not simple. The archive behaves more like a corridor full of doors that open into rooms built in different centuries, with everyone insisting the furniture has always been there. That is why confusion itself can become a clue, though not in the sensational way mystery books promise. The confusion does not prove a secret. It reveals a living tradition. One interpretation is that when stories overlap, imperfectly preserve different emotional tones or leave puzzling gaps, they may be preserving older uncertainty instead of resolving it. A careful reading might suggest that the inconsistencies themselves tell you something important. The scribes are not handing you a final verdict. They are handing you a layered memory of a world that never fully settled its own fears. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian scribes were highly trained conservative and serious about preservation. They copied lexical lists, hymns, epics, omens, series, rituals, and scholarly materials with remarkable care. The evidence we do have points to a culture that valued textual continuity deeply, but continuity is not sameness. A more cautious explanation could be that old texts survive because they remain useful, not because every detail still means what it once did. Some stories are preserved because they legitimize kings, some because they guide ritual, some because they teach language, and some perhaps because they continue to resonate emotionally in ways even the scribes do not fully explain. That resonance becomes especially noticeable when you compare the emotional habits of the literature. Divine motion, absence, descent, warning, disruption, restoration. Again and again, these motifs return, though never in exactly the same arrangement. Most historians agree that recurring themes across long traditions can reflect enduring concerns without implying one secret event behind them all. That is the safe and sensible path. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if the archive keeps repeating these motifs because it has inherited not an answer, but an unresolved pressure? Not a hidden truth, but a bruise that later generations keep touching to see whether it still hurts. A fringe idea proposes that contradictions and overlaps in Mesopotamian myth preserve traces of an older, largely lost narrative in which the gods themselves faced a threat greater than earthly disorder. This theory isn't widely accepted and the evidence is thin. Most historians would say rightly that contradictions are exactly what you expect in a long multilingual scribal tradition shaped by changing politics and theology. That is the stronger explanation. Still, if we treat the fringe idea as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it becomes less absurd than it first sounds. Not because it is well supported, but because the literature often feels like it remembers more tension than it can clearly articulate. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the traditions layer over time. We know older Sumerian materials are reworked in later settings. We know the names and roles of deities can shift. We know that preserved texts are curated pieces of a much larger lost archive. What we cannot confirm is how much vanished with the broken tablets, the collapsed libraries, and the centuries of selective copying. That is where imagination naturally rushes in, usually wearing boots much louder than the evidence deserves. So let me rephrase that more carefully. The missing pieces do not license grand certainty, they simply leave space. And space in ancient studies can be strangely powerful. If a city lament survives, but the matching ritual commentary does not, if a myth survives in one version, but not another, if a divine title appears in fragmentary form across contexts, the archive begins to feel like a shoreline after a storm. Bits remain, patterns glimmer, larger shapes are possible but never secure. Most historians agree that working with fragmentary evidence demands restraint. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the emotional outcome of all this layering is unmistakable. The old world does not hand you a stable divine universe wrapped neatly in final doctrine. It hands you a sacred atmosphere full of maintenance, motion warnings, losses, and returns. One interpretation is that this complexity reflects the maturity of a civilization that knows order is never effortless. Another is that later scribes preserve unresolved questions because those questions remain useful, haunting, and true to experience. Historians still argue whether that lingering tension belongs mainly to theology, politics, or literary inheritance. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there never could be. A living tradition does not exist to satisfy your modern appetite for one definitive answer and a labelled diagram. It exists to be copied, argued with, adapted, and performed. Ancient Mesopotamia is full of systems, but it is not tidy in the way modern myth hunters often crave. That may be the most revealing clue of all. The confusion does not weaken the archive. It humanises it. It shows that even great civilizations carry forward their doubts. So you stand now in the middle of those overlapping voices, hearing Sumerian echoes inside Akkadian, phrasing later hands preserving earlier unease, and the whole archive begins to feel less like a monument than like wet footprints crossing clay before the rain smooths them away. Most historians agree that Sumerian and later Akkadian traditions overlap, adapt, and reinterpret older myths. A careful reading might suggest that this layering preserves unresolved questions better than answers. And what if the confusion itself is the clue not to a hidden revelation, but to a civilization that kept feeling the same pressure long after it forgot exactly where the pressure began? The pressure that lingers after memory fades is often the most difficult kind to name. because by now you have walked through cities, floods, temples, laments, skies and layered texts, and what remains is not a clean answer but a shape in the background. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian instability can be explained in large part through very earthly causes: shifting rivers, drought, stress, crop failure, warfare, dynastic rivalry, migration, trade disruption, and the ordinary violence of states trying to remain states. What's broadly accepted is that you do not need a hidden cosmic enemy to explain why cities tremble. Archaeology suggests that environmental and political pressure are more than enough. Human beings, after all, have always been perfectly capable of making life terrifying without supernatural assistance. That grounded explanation matters because it keeps the story honest. If a temple is damaged, armies may be involved. If a city is abandoned, economics, ecology, and power may all be involved. If a king panics over omens, he may simply be a king living in a world where one bad season can become a coup with extra ceremony. Most historians agree that the mainstream framework remains the strongest one, but a careful reading might suggest that later retellings, divine movements, and atmospheric tensions sometimes make the old stories feel as though disorder is not only local, it feels larger, wider, almost ambient. And that is where the more speculative side of tonight's puzzle steps softly back into the room. A popular rumour claims that the gods, or at least the beings later grouped in dramatic modern ways under labels like the Anunnaki, seem oddly wary in some readings, as though they are not simply managing chaos below, but reacting to a force beyond their own comfort. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. We should say that plainly. The evidence we do have points much more securely toward literary theology, symbolic politics, and cultural memory of disaster. Still, if we treat the rumour as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it helps explain why certain texts continue to feel charged. They are full of power, yes, but also of motion, retreat, warning, descent, and repair. That emotional pattern invites the question even when the texts refuse to answer it directly. Historians still argue whether such tension in Mesopotamian myth should be read mainly as the dramatization of human instability or as evidence of more complex theological unease. The debate matters because the gods in these stories are not always still, and stillness is what we tend to expect from beings in full command. Instead, you get councils, decrees, withdrawals, omens, absences, laments, crossings, and the constant maintenance of sacred order. One interpretation is that this simply mirrors the political and environmental precarity of ancient life. That is a strong and likely explanation. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories are also preserving a deep intuition that danger exists beyond any single city, dynasty, or season. That intuition does not need to mean a literal monster beyond the stars, much as certain modern books would dearly love to sell you one with a dramatic cover and extremely confident subtitles. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The larger adversary in the old stories may be less a being than a condition. It may be chaos itself, not as a cartoon villain, but as the permanent possibility that order can break. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is deeply concerned with maintaining cosmic and social order against disorder. What's broadly accepted is that divine action often serves to establish boundaries, decrees, and hierarchies that keep the world inhabitable. In that sense, the greater adversary is already present in the mainstream reading. It is not hidden, it is the pressure of unmaking. And yet the literary mood sometimes makes that pressure feel almost personal. A careful reading might suggest that the old stories do not treat disorder as merely abstract. It arrives in floods, invasions, divine withdrawals, ominous skies, disrupted rituals, and empty sanctuaries. One interpretation is that these are simply the forms chaos takes in human experience. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if for the people who shaped these texts, disorder felt so large and so intelligent in its timing that it was easiest to imagine the gods themselves adjusting to it, bracing against it, or stepping aside when it surged too strongly? A fringe idea proposes that behind the public myths lies the memory of a force above or beyond the named gods, a power not fully described because it was never fully understood. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it captures something the texts do genuinely preserve as symmetry. The gods are mighty, yet not always comfortable. Sacred order is real, yet never automatic. The heavens are meaningful, yet still watched for warning. Most historians would say quite reasonably that all of this can be explained within Mesopotamian theology and lived instability. That is the stronger path. Still, if the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and if imagination lingers, we will keep it in the gentler lane of possibility. You begin to notice that the larger adversary, whether literal or symbolic, always hides behind the same signs: movement, retreat, delay, repetition, rebuilding. The old world behaves like a place that expects disruption, not as a rare exception, but as a recurring guest. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian civilization is resilient precisely because it is built in dialogue with precarity. Canals must be redrawn, walls must be rebuilt, rituals must be restored, kingship must be relegitimated. One interpretation is that this reveals a mature understanding of history. Nothing lasts without work. A more cautious explanation could be that this constant repair leaves an emotional residue in the literature, making even the gods seem weary at times. Scholars continue to debate whether cosmic conflict in Mesopotamian literature should be read through mythic pattern historical metaphor or later interpretive overlay. There's no full consensus. Some readers emphasize creation and kingship themes, where divine rule emerges over unruly forces. Others emphasize lament and omen traditions, where order is always on the verge of cracking. Both are useful. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the texts imagine a world under pressure. We know divine authority is repeatedly asserted. We know sacred structures matter because they are vulnerable. What we cannot confirm is whether the emotional tone of divine unease points to anything more specific than the old and universal fear that order is temporary. That may already be enough. In fact, it may be the deepest answer the texts can offer, without breaking their own style. Ancient Mesopotamian religion does not hand you a polished doctrine of perfect safety. It gives you systems rituals, names, rankings, decrees, and a lot of clay devoted to the ongoing struggle to keep the world coherent. If the gods sometimes seem to move like beings under pressure, perhaps that is because they are carrying the same burden as the cities, below the burden of holding back collapse. Not because they are weak, but because collapse is large. And perhaps that is why the modern imagination keeps returning to these stories with such stubborn fascination. A tale in which the Anunnaki or other divine beings are escaping something bigger is dramatic, yes, but beneath the drama lies a simpler emotional truth. Human beings have always suspected that whatever protects them may itself be under strain. That is a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated, but it gives the old literature a pulse that still feels strangely familiar. So you follow the pressure into the background and let it remain mostly unnamed. Most historians agree that conflict, drought, migration and political rivalry explain much of Mesopotamian instability. A popular rumour claims the gods in later retellings seem wary of a force above or beyond them. And what if the greater adversary in these texts is not a neatly revealed enemy at all, but the old patient ever-returning pressure of disorder itself? The thing no city, no king, and perhaps not even the highest beings could ever fully command. The pressure remains unnamed, and perhaps that is why it feels larger here than any creature, weapon, or single event ever could. By now you have moved through the old landscape long enough to notice that the clues do not gather into a neat confession, they gather into a mood. Most historians agree that myths often compress human fears into divine drama, and Mesopotamian literature is especially skilled at doing this without losing its dignity. What's broadly accepted is that stories of gods, councils, omens, departures and restorations reflect lived instability translated into sacred language. Archaeology suggests that ancient communities on the Mesopotamian plain live with recurring pressure from environment, politics, labour demands and war. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that knows how thin the line is between order and unravelling. That is the solid ground. And yet once you collect all those motifs together, one interpretation is that stories of retreat, concealment and divided authority may encode a memory of overwhelming uncertainty rather than a memory of one particular disaster. That distinction matters. You do not need a literal hidden war in heaven to produce literature that sounds tense. A more cautious explanation could be that the texts preserve the emotional experience of being unable to locate the true centre of danger. Floods happen, yes. Armies march, yes. Crops fail, kings misjudge, rituals falter. But what makes a civilization anxious for centuries is often not one crisis. It is the feeling that crisis can arrive from too many directions at once. That feeling gives a strange coherence to all the pieces you have been carrying. The gods move. Sacred order must be renewed. Cities lament abandonment. Omens multiply. Thresholds matter. The heavens are watched. The underworld resists. The archive layers one voice over another without ever quite relaxing its grip. Most historians agree that these are recognizable features of Mesopotamian religion and literature. But a careful reading might suggest that together they describe not triumph but management. The cosmos in these texts is not a static castle already secured. It is an ongoing project, a defended border, a system under maintenance. Ancient civilization in this sense feels less like a settled empire and more like a household forever checking whether the roof still holds. Historians still argue whether these recurring motifs should be treated mainly as literary habits, as expressions of theological subtlety, or as cultural memory shaped by repeated instability. The debate matters because tonight's larger possibility lives exactly in that ambiguity. If the old stories are simply elegant ways of describing ordinary ancient pressures, that is enough. But if they also preserve a more diffuse sense of overwhelming uncertainty, then the idea of the Anunnaki or other high beings as something like refugees becomes emotionally intelligible, even if it remains historically unproven. That's a possibility, not a certainty. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And the clue you now follow is not one tablet or one line. It is the logic of repeated retreat. One interpretation is that when divine power is shown, withdrawing, hiding, or redistributing itself, the literature may be encoding the truth that authority sometimes survives by movement rather than confrontation. That is not exotic. Human rulers do this constantly. So do institutions. So do families pretending they are fine at dinner. Most historians agree that myth often projects earthly realities upward into sacred form. A more cautious explanation could be that divine retreat in Mesopotamian literature reflects the same strategic instinct visible in human politics: preserve the centre by yielding the edge. But what if the story is pointing at something else as well? What if retreat is not only strategy? What if it is memory? A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki, in later mystery-heavy interpretations, were not conquerors at all, but refugees with excellent branding. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians would reject it as a modern reframing of ancient divine categories that already make sense in religious and literary terms. That is the stronger explanation. Still, the reason the fringe idea feels oddly sticky is because it mirrors the emotional architecture of the texts. Powerful beings are often depicted not as lounging in effortless supremacy, but as governing amid threat, warning, and recurring loss. If you imagine them not as masters at peace, but as authorities under pressure, suddenly the old movements of departure and concealment begin to look different. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not say in any plain or documented way that the Anunnaki are fugitives from a larger cosmic force. The evidence for that specific claim is not there, but a careful reading might suggest that stories of retreat, concealment, and divided authority preserve a memory of overwhelming uncertainty so persistent that later readers naturally personify it. They want an enemy. They want a name. They want the thing beyond the gate to step into the light and introduce itself like a proper villain. Ancient literature is usually too elegant for that. It leaves the pressure mostly unnamed and lets the ritual system carry the weight. That may be why the idea feels so haunting. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know Mesopotamian texts are full of responses to instability. We know divine authority is repeatedly staged, restored and reaffirmed. We know withdrawal and return matter deeply. What we cannot confirm is whether the emotional shape of all this points to a danger thought of as larger than any city, storm or king. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here it is thin, but the atmosphere remains. You notice it especially when you think about human behaviour under sustained stress. People do not always record the true shape of fear directly. Often they ritualize it. They make schedules around it. They turn it into ceremony titles, processions and formulas. Most historians agree that religion often serves exactly this function, not as deception, but as structure. It gives recurring form to recurring vulnerability. A more cautious explanation could be that Mesopotamian religion becomes so administratively rich because administration is one of the few available answers to precarity. Write it down, name the god, repair the temple, watch the sky, read the sign, reinstall the king, begin again. It is cosmic order, yes, but also the ancient art of coping with style. That is why the refugee image, though speculative, carries emotional force. Not because it is historically demonstrated, but because it captures the pattern of beings maintaining order while never sounding entirely beyond threat. Scholars continue to debate how much anxiety, if any, should be read into divine narratives of movement and concealment. There's no full consensus. Some readers hear only theology and literary convention. Others hear a civilization's long memory of instability echoing through every sacred form. Both readings have merit. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. So if you follow the clues without demanding a dramatic verdict, the picture that forms is subtle rather than sensational. Most historians agree that myths compress human fears into divine drama. One interpretation is that stories of retreat, concealment, and divided authority may encode a memory of overwhelming uncertainty. And what if, in the most careful and sleepiest sense, the Anunnaki in these readings are not victorious rulers standing outside history, but figures caught inside the same fragile struggle as everyone else, holding order together while listening for footsteps beyond the firelight. The footsteps beyond the firelight begin to fade into something even more elusive now, because after all the temples, laments, skies and tablets, you finally have to face the simplest and hardest truth of the whole journey. Every surviving line was written by human hands. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts are human products, shaped by scribes, priests, rulers and communities working within ritual, political and literary traditions. What's broadly accepted is that the gods of Sumer and their later interpreters come to us through clay, not direct voice. Archaeology suggests extraordinary continuity in scribal culture, but also constant shaping, selecting, copying and reframing. The evidence we do have points not to unfiltered revelation, but to memory under pressure, carefully preserved in signs. That does not weaken the old stories. If anything, it makes them more impressive. Human beings took flood, fierce city collapse, divine absence, celestial unease, royal fragility and the stubborn need for order, and they built from all that a literature still capable of whispering across millennia. One interpretation is that the biggest mystery here is not hidden beings at all, but the power of human meaning making. That may sound less dramatic than cosmic escape, but in its own quiet way, it is just as strange. A more cautious explanation could be that the grandeur of these texts comes from the fact that they hold together two opposite needs at once. They want the universe to feel ordered, and they want suffering to mean something. That combination gives the writing its peculiar depth. You can feel it most clearly when you step back from the Anunnaki question and look at the larger emotional architecture. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion is a system of relationships between city and deity, king and legitimacy, heaven and omen temple, and presence, death and descent, flood and survival. What's broadly accepted is that these stories help communities think about vulnerability in a world where little is guaranteed. But a careful reading might suggest that the greatest thing the texts preserve is not a secret answer, but a disciplined uncertainty. They do not deny fear, they ritualize it. They do not erase disorder. They rank it, name it, sing against it, and rebuild after it. That is why the old archive can feel both stable and haunted. The scribes are conservative, methodical, and serious. They copy signs carefully. They train students. They preserve forms. Ancient bureaucracy once again shows up looking much more emotionally important than you expected. But beneath that precision there is a pulse. The pulse says the world must be maintained because it does not maintain itself. Temples must be repaired. Omens must be read. Kings must be blessed. Laments must be performed. Thresholds must be crossed. In order. One interpretation is that this reveals a civilization deeply committed to sacred order. A more cautious explanation could be that it also reveals a civilization that does not quite trust order to stay put unless everyone keeps working. Historians still argue whether the deepest meaning of Mesopotamian myth lies in theology, politics, ritual practice, literary artistry, or some blend of all four. The debate matters because your answer changes what kind of mystery you think you are hearing. If you emphasize theology, the gods are agents of order. If you emphasize politics, the stories manage legitimacy. If you emphasize ritual, they stabilize communities. If you emphasize literary artistry, they preserve emotional truth through narrative form. None of these cancel the others. In fact, the richness comes from their overlap. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And one thing we cannot confirm is how the ancient hearers balanced all these layers in their own minds. A fringe idea proposes that the surviving texts are only the polished public layer of a much stranger lost tradition, one in which the Anunnaki and other divine beings were remembered as participants in a larger cosmic crisis. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence is thin. Most historians would say, rightly, that we should not turn gaps in the archive into permission slips for absolute speculation. That is the stronger position. Still, if we treat the idea as a possibility, rather than a conclusion, it reveals something useful about modern readers. We keep searching for a hidden layer because the official layer already feels haunted. The old stories sound as though they are circling something they will not fully name. But perhaps that is exactly what human beings do when the true shape of danger is too large to describe cleanly. They build symbols. They assign divine offices. They create sacred geographies. They tell stories where gods depart, descend, argue, restore, and withdraw. Most historians agree that myth is one of humanity's oldest tools for holding together what ordinary language cannot manage on its own. A careful reading might suggest that the greatest puzzle in Mesopotamian literature is not whether the gods were escaping something bigger, but whether humans were trying to give form to a darkness they could feel without ever fully defining. What if the stories are pointing at something else? Not toward a hidden empire beyond the stars, not toward a secret set of tablets, waiting to settle every debate, but toward the human need to build grandeur against uncertainty. The temple rises because the river can fail. The omen series grows because the future feels unstable. The lament survives because the city once did not. The divine assembly matters because earthly assemblies fracture. A more cautious explanation could be that the Anunnaki endure in imagination, not because they solve the puzzle, but because they stand at the place where order and mystery meet. They are large enough to carry the fear without dissolving it. That may be why later ages keep returning to them. Not because the evidence proves some hidden truth, but because the old names still glow in the dark. Anunnaki, Enlil, Inanna, Nippur, Ekur, Utnapishtim. Each one is both a documented part of ancient religion and a door into interpretation. Most historians agree that these names belong first to the real literary and religious world of Mesopotamia. That is the ground you should not abandon. But if imagination walks beside that ground, softly and honestly, another possibility appears. These stories may function like a nightlight built against a darkness no one can define. Scholars continue to debate how much modern mystery culture helps or distorts our reading of ancient Mesopotamia. There's no full consensus, though many would warn correctly against forcing ancient texts to flatter modern fantasies. That warning is wise. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The old literature deserves patience, not extraction. It is already interesting without being turned into a trailer for a secret apocalypse. At the same time, the emotional openness of the texts explains why mystery gathers around them. They leave room. They preserve tension. They do not close every door. So you sit at last with the scribes themselves, not as gatekeepers of a hidden final answer, but as the true magicians of the story. They are the ones who shaped clay into continuity. They are the ones who made fear speak in ritual language. They are the ones who separated decree from chaos line by line, even when the walls of their cities did not always hold. Most historians agree that human scribes shape every surviving line for ritual politics and remembrance. One interpretation is that the biggest mystery is human meaning-making rather than hidden beings. And what if the grandeur of the texts, all their cosmic names and uneasy gods and doors left half open, is really the oldest nightlight of all, a fragile human lamp set against a darkness too large to measure? The fragile human lamp remains with you now as the night grows quieter, because after all the speculation, all the laments, all the gates and tablets and uneasy skies, what stays behind is not a solved riddle, but a final mood. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature endures because it preserves both order and anxiety with unusual honesty. What's broadly accepted is that these texts come from real cities, real ritual systems, real environmental pressures, and real traditions of kingship and temple life. Archaeology suggests that ancient Sumer and the wider Mesopotamian world were sophisticated, fragile, inventive, and deeply aware of uncertainty. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that never assumes safety is automatic. It builds watches, restores counts, sings and mourns, precisely because the world so often slips. And so you come back gently to the question that brought you here. Sumerian texts reveal the Anunnaki were escaping something bigger. That title is dramatic, of course, and drama has always known how to pull at your sleeve. But if we speak carefully, the old tablets do not plainly declare such a thing in the way a modern headline might wish. A more cautious explanation could be that they preserve a world in which even divine authority is surrounded by motion, warning departure and repair. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki stories linger because they never fully settle their own fear. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. Most historians agree that the safer reading remains theological and historical. The gods of Mesopotamia move through literary roles shaped by ritual life, political legitimacy, cosmic order, and human responses to disaster. Flood stories may grow from real river fears. City laments may preserve memories of actual collapse. Descent myths may dramatize mortality power and sacred threshold. Omen texts may reveal a civilization trying to read uncertainty before uncertainty reads it first. That is already a rich and compelling world. You do not need to force it into a single hidden truth machine. The old literature is far more subtle than that. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the atmosphere of escape does remain. The gods withdraw, presence thins, sacred centres must be restored. The heavens are watched, the underworld resists, the archive remembers unease across centuries. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the final image is not of supreme beings ruling from effortless certainty, but of a sacred order that survives by movement, adaptation, and sometimes retreat? Not because the texts prove a hidden cosmic enemy, but because they understand something quieter and perhaps deeper. Even the highest order may live beside uncertainty. Historians still argue whether the emotional tension of Mesopotamian literature belongs mostly to earthly instability or to more expansive theological imagination. Scholars continue to debate how much later readers should infer from repeated motifs of absence and return. There's no full consensus. And perhaps that is fitting. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the cities were real. We know the clay was real. We know the rituals mattered. We know the fears were not invented for entertainment. What we cannot confirm is whether the old names ever pointed even dimly toward a threat, imagined as larger than the gods themselves. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here it remains thin. But the fact that the answer stays open may be the most Mesopotamian ending possible. This is a tradition that preserves decrees and doubts together. It gives you systems and silences in the same hand. It leaves thresholds half lit. It shows you a temple, a floodplain, a king before an omen, a goddess before a gate, a ruined city where the sanctuary has gone quiet, and then it asks you to live with the tension, not solve it, not conquer it. Just live with it as people always have. Ancient civilization in its softer moments is basically the long human art of making tea while the horizon stays suspicious. And so you let the question rest, not because it has been answered, but because it has been carried far enough for one night. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We kept the solid ground separate from the mist. We followed the clues without forcing them into confession. We let the temples stand where archaeology places them. We let the laments grieve what history allows. We let the Anunnaki remain what the evidence makes possible divine figures in a literature that never stops circling order, danger, and the ache of uncertain protection. Now the pace can soften. The river is farther away. The clay cools in the dark. The temple courts empty of their daytime footfalls. Somewhere a lamp burns low beside a stack of tablets no one will read again until morning. The stars hang above the plain with their old patient brightness, and whether they are warnings or witnesses no longer matters tonight. The kings have finished their petitions. The priests have spoken their words. The scribes have pressed their signs and covered the wet clay, carefully trusting that memory for now will hold. You can let the questions drift now like silt settling through slow water. The flood has passed into story. The omens have quieted into dust. The gates of the underworld are closed. Nippur sleeps beneath its own sacred weight. Inanna has gone where she must go and returned where she can. Enlil remains in the hush of old authority. The Anunnaki, whatever exactly they were meant to be in each age and line, recede into the larger dark where ancient names live, best not as solved equations, but as soft shapes at the edge of understanding. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the final comfort is not certainty, but companionship. Across all that distance, those old people also looked up, also worried, also built systems against collapse, also hoped that order would hold one more season. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature survives because it preserves that human effort with remarkable clarity. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki stories endure because they never fully resolve their unease. And what if the doorway they leave open is not leading to terror at all, but to the quiet truth that every age, even one dressed in gods and clay, has lived beside a larger silence and kept the lamp burning anyway? So the night can loosen now. The cities drift back into shadow. The river plains flatten into darkness. The names grow gentler as they move away. And you, safely far from the heat and dust and temple, accounting, and extremely judgmental Bronze Age goats, can simply rest. Let the old world become quieter. Let the clay harden. Let the questions sleep where they belong, among reeds, stars' ruined walls, and the soft human wish that whatever is bigger than us might for one more night pass by without entering.